Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This episode is brought to you by our Grad School Rockstar program and Dissertation Rockstar Bootcamp. If you or someone you know is an interdisciplinary grad student who wants to get serious about finishing their dissertation, having better work-life balance, or building a career that lets your whole self thrive, come join us. You get a personal coach who knows your projects and is there to help every step of the way, activities and lessons to help you create sustainable habits for writing and self-care, twice monthly webinars on topics like working with advisors and being an academic while parenting, as well as lifetime access to weekly office hours and our amazing community to help you rock your interdisciplinary career, wherever that might take you. You can go to ideasonfire.net for more information on how to enroll. This is episode 33, and my guest today is E. Patrick Johnson, who's the chair of African American Studies and also a professor of performance studies at Northwestern University. As a scholar-artist, he has published widely in the areas of race, gender, sexuality, and performance. He's written 2 award-winning books, Appropriating Blackness, Performance and the Politics of Authenticity, as well as Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, An Oral History. He's also the editor or co-editor of several essay collections, including Black Queer Studies, a critical anthology, Cultural Struggles, Performance, Ethnography, Praxis, Solo Black Woman, Scripts, Interviews, and Essays, No Tea, No Shade, New Writings in Black Queer Studies, and Blacktino Queer. He is currently working on a creative nonfiction text called Honeypot, Black Southern Women Who Love Women, which we talk about in the interview. His play, Sweet Tea, which is based on his scholarly book of the same name, was co-produced by About Face Theater and the Ellen Stone Belloc Institute for the Study of Women and Gender in the Arts and Media at Columbia College Chicago. In our interview, E. Patrick Johnson and I talk about his creative process, how he translates scholarly ideas into artistic work, and vice versa, how Black gay men and women are crafting community-based oral histories, and how artistic and scholarly collaboration is a key way that he imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us.
I'm really excited to be here.
So you're the playwright of Sweet Tea, which is based on your scholarly book, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, An Oral History. I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about that play and maybe how it relates to the scholarly project.
Well, the play, Sweet Tea, has had various manifestations, and it has had, 4 different directors, and it's been a work in progress. But it came about because I was actually doing a one-person show that really wasn't a fully developed piece. It was more like a stage reading that I called Pouring Tea, Black Gay Men of the South Tell Their Tales. And the idea for that came about halfway into me collecting the oral histories, with me thinking that, this should be a performance, because I met so many wonderful storytellers, so many men who their interviews turned into these sort of like drama within a drama, play within a play. And I was trying to figure out, how can I capture this on the page? And there really wasn't a way to do that. And because I'm in performance studies and because I'm a performer, I decided that I would create a show that tried to capture as best as possible some of the nuance of the language, the different Southern dialects, because the way people speak in New Orleans is very different from the way people speak in North Carolina, which is different from the way people speak in Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, and so on and so forth. And also give people a kind of suggestion of the men's mannerisms. So when I came up with the idea for the performance, I didn't know whether I would do the performer performances or if I would cast other actors. And then I decided, well, I'm the one conducting the interviews. I'm the one who met these men, interacted with them, and become a part of their lives. So it would be interesting for me to actually do the performance. And also because I'm a performer, so it in some ways made a lot of sense. So I started doing the stage reading. And then in 2008, I think it was, Jane Sachs, who at that time was she was director of a center at Columbia College. And she had a program where she invited artists to come to her center and develop work. She approached me about developing what was then a stage reading into a full production. And I became a fellow at the center and started working with other artists, particularly directors, choreographers, musicians, actors, doing workshops of the script. And out of that, those workshops came this idea for a play that would still have me as the solo performer, but one of the things that everybody who participated in those workshops said, we need your story. And so I was very hesitant about that. And because, my impetus for doing the book was never about me. It was about these men's lives. But everyone said, the thing that's interesting about this work is your relationship to these men. And since you are Black and gay and from the South, it only makes sense that your story would be a part of it. So that was very daunting. And I resisted, but finally relented. And so I wrote my story into what eventually became the play. And so the conceit of the play is that I, E. Patrick Johnson, have to go on a journey of self-discovery, listening to other Black gay men's story of the South in order to find my own voice and tell my own story. In the first iteration of the play, which debuted in Chicago through a collaboration with Jane Sachs and About Face Theater, it premiered in 2010, in April of 2010, and the first director was Daniel Alexander Jones out of New York.
That's a fascinating process. It's interesting that it was actually collaborative work. It was workshopping it that your own voice came to be added to it. Was this the first time you had done kind of autobiographical material?
No, it wasn't. My first show actually was autobiographical, called Strange Fruit. And that was a show that I developed in the late 90s. But it was autobiographical, but it was also very academic. It was a lot of academic jargon in it and so on and so forth. I guess the difference between that first show and this one was I started Sweet Tea with the idea of it not being about me. So that was my hesitance about inserting myself into the project, because I didn't want it to be about me. Not realizing that no matter what you do, what kind of scholarship you do, you're always in it because you're the one crafting the questions. You're the one, telling the story that's being told to you. So you're always implicated in it.
It's a really fascinating work of translation, right? Moving from the more scholarly oral history approach to the performance, to the autobiographical material. These are genres that don't often get to crisscross with one another. That's what's so fantastic about it. So if for this project you started with the scholarly approach, the oral history collection, and then it got translated into a performance, do you ever go the other way? Like start with a performance or a play idea and then translate it into scholarship somehow?
Yes. So perhaps one of my most well-known essays, called Queer Studies, or Almost Everything I Know About Queer Studies, I learned from my grandmother. It's a tongue twister.
That's a great title.
That started out as a performance piece, a script that I wanted to write to talk about queer theory and how I felt outside of it as a person of color. Because at that time, I mean, this is actually also the late 90s, early 2000s, when queer theory was really kind of taken hold in the academy, but it was still, there was a lot of work that didn't have to do with race. And there was also the sense that people of color had the privilege of dismissing or discounting members of their own communities who also might be homophobic in order to privilege sexuality as the key identity marker. And that's not true. And my grandmother was a classic example. My grandmother was homophobic, but it was also my grandmother from whom I learned feminist ideas and feminist practice, as she worked as a live-in domestic worker for 18 years to provide for her family. So I thought about creating a play about that, but it wasn't working in that genre. And so it then became an essay. And again, that essay to this day is probably the one that I'm most well known for.
How do you figure out if it's working in a genre? And then how do you figure out is it experimentation? You try it in different mediums and see what seems to stick more? Do you have a particular kind of ritual or way you determine that?
I sort of just let the muse do its thing and guide me, because, my process is this, I work in these kind of in a sporadic way. I'll sometimes just wake up in the middle of the night because something has come to me, and I'll get up and I'll just start writing. And so I just go with the flow, and I sort of get into these zones. There are other times where it's me looking at a blinking cursor.
Oh, the curse of the blank page. I'm quite familiar.
Yes, and it's just like, oh my God, there's nothing. There's no motivation. There's no anything. So I just sort of go with what feeling that I'm having at that time and just give into it. But I also let things sit for a while. So I may write something and then I'll let it sit to marinate, and then come back to it to see if I still like it. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I tweak. Like, for instance, I'm working on the follow-up to Sweet Tea right now, which is called Honeypot, and it's actually going to be 2 different books. And one version is going to be a kind of traditional oral history project, but the other version of the book is going to be creative nonfiction. And the creative nonfiction version I finished in January, but I've let it to sort of sit for a minute, and now that I've had time to be away from it, I know that the ending is wrong, so I'm going to change the ending. So it really just depends. That's my process, is when I have to get it out, when the muse is sitting on my shoulder, I just let her speak to me and we go. And when she's not, I don't try to force it.
I'm curious if you find it more challenging to do kind of creative work, or artistic work, I should say, versus scholarly, or does it depend on the topic? Does it depend on, that month or that mood or whatever? But what are the kind of unique challenges of both of those genres?
Yeah, when they do both have their challenges. One of the things that they both have in common, for me, I won't speak for other scholar artists, is you always have the audience that you're speaking to in your head. So, for instance, when I'm working on an academic book, I'm always thinking about my colleagues in the field who are going to be reading it. And so that kind of shapes the voice of the piece. It kind of shapes the argument, and so on and so forth. Same thing with creative work. You sort of anticipate, well, who's going to come see this, or who's going to read this piece of creative work, and that sort of guides you to. For instance, one of the funny things that happened in the process of working on the creative nonfiction version of Honeypot is my editor read the preface the draft of the preface. And, I thought that I had taken out all academic jargon because, we really want to market this to a general audience. And he pointed out all these places where I had lapsed from his perspective into a kind of academic speak. And it was like, no, you got to take that out, take that out, take that out.
That's a good editor. That's a sign of a good editor.
Yeah. It was great to have his eye thinking about it from, could my mother, for instance, pick this up and read it? Would she understand, what I was saying in this particular one? So you have the audience in your head when you're working on an academic piece or a creative piece. But at some point, you have to be true to your own voice and say what you want to say, regardless of what you think your colleagues are going to say or an audience, because at the end of the day, everybody comes to a piece of work from their own perspective and will read it the way they're going to read it, and you have no control over that. And you shouldn't try to have control over it.
So many of your projects are collaborative. You talked about the development project with Sweet Tea, and you've edited a number of scholarly essays and worked with the authors in that process. You've done performer interviews. So much of your both written and your performative work is done with others. And it's certainly something that, to a certain degree, performance studies emphasizes, but not a lot of other academic fields do. That image of the lone scholar in their office by themselves, untouched by the rest of the world, which we all know is not true, but the myth persists. But I'm curious, what draws you to collaboration as a creative, as a mode of creation?
What I think is the irony about that, Cathy, is the hard sciences do a lot of collaboration.
They do, in labs.
They have, there might be 10 people working on the same problem. There's usually a principal investigator, but there are all these people, working on trying to find a cure for cancer or trying to find some genome or trying to do this, so on and so forth. In the humanities, it's just the opposite. We're all like squirreled away, sitting hunchback in front of a computer by ourselves with our own thoughts and madness. That's the paradox. But I think one of the things for me about collaboration is just like that lab for the scientists. When you have a group of creative minds together working on your project, it is such a joyous and frustrating and challenging and rewarding process. When I'm working on traditional scholarship, it is very lonely, and I'm, sort of sitting, in front of the computer by myself. And the only time I get feedback is the moment in which I give a talk somewhere, but that's on a little tiny piece of, entire book, or when my editor gives me feedback, or when he or she sends it out to reviews, and that's usually 2 to 3 people. So it's a very tiny circle of people that are giving you feedback about the work. Whereas when you're doing performative work and you have a whole team of folks, it's a very different experience, and the feedback is amazing sometimes because you're getting responses from people who are coming to the work fresh. It's all in your head as the artist, but for other folks, they're hearing it for the first time, and they see blind spots in the work. They see gaps that you didn't see. It's like, well, this doesn't make sense because you had this person do this in this part of the play, but how did we get from point A to point B? You've made that leap in your own head, but not thinking about, oh yeah, I guess I kind of have to help you get there as the audience. So that's wonderful. Also, I love working with people who have expertise in areas I don't. For instance, when I was working on the play Sweet Tea and working with a sound designer who you get to talk to about, this is what I was thinking when I was writing this particular passage, and how can we make that come alive sonically, and then have that person go away and then bring back something and you go, oh my God, that's it, or oh my God, that's not it. Those kind of things, or a light designer who really get the feeling that you're trying to create and creates this other world, or a prop person, or a musician, or a choreographer, or the director who you always have a love-hate relationship with, even when it's your own work. So I love that kind of collaborative process, because for me, it only makes the work better. But I also like collaborating on traditional scholarship. And so I've done 3 anthologies that were co-edited with scholars, and I really enjoyed that process as well. I love working with other scholars on projects.
Do you have any advice for folks who might be more inclined to collaboration, or wanting to incorporate more collaboration into their work, either artistically or scholarly?
Yes, I do. Because one of the things that I also know is that while collaboration is great, collaboration is hard. And so it's really important that you be very comfortable with your collaborators, because nothing can torpedo a project quicker than having people who are working together who don't like each other, or who don't enjoy each other's company. For me, it's important that I trust my collaborators. It's important that I respect my collaborators, because if you don't have trust and you don't have respect, then that's not going to work out very well. Then that doesn't mean that you need to surround yourself with people who are just going to agree with you. That's not what I'm saying, because as I said before, getting feedback from people is really what you want, and you're asking them for their, professional opinion, or even just their gut reaction to it. But it's also important that you have people who, are going to be supportive and who are on the same page with you about the goals that you have for the work that you're trying to do.
I'm curious how you see your work combining academia, art, and activism. So much of your creative work, your scholarly work, is such a fantastic braid of those 3 realms. And I'm curious, what drew you to that braid? Why do you combine these things?
I often describe myself as an academic trickster, because you can't really locate me in any one discipline per se, which is why I have 3 different affiliations at Northwestern. I'm in performance studies, African American studies, gender and sexuality studies. And my work is sort of interdisciplinary. But my goal has always been, as an academic, as a professor, performer, is to do that work in the service of changing the world. And for me, I can't approach any project or follow through with any project that I don't think is going to have some substantive impact on the world in which I live. Now, it may not be as impactful as changing a particular law, for instance, but it may change the discourse around a particular topic, such that people who do have the ability to affect laws think differently, so that when they go in to vote, or they go into that meeting that's going to impact the lives of people, because they've seen Sweet Tea and they can now put a human face on a particular issue, then there's the potential for change there. But it's also important to me, too, that my work be legible to the people about whom I write. So that was really important to me for Sweet Tea, that the people that I interviewed be able to pick up the book and understand it, and that I wouldn't render their lives in a way that they didn't even recognize. For me, that's also a kind of activism, because, sometimes so many academics get caught up in writing for other academics that we forget that we have, I would argue, an ethical and moral responsibility to provide access to some of these theories and some of these discourses to people who are outside the ivory tower. And so it's important to me to make the work legible.
I think that's a great transition into talking about your next project, or your current project, I guess.
Yeah.
What's that all about, and how did it come out of maybe the work you did on Sweet Tea?
Yeah. So, originally I was going to focus on men and women when I first started Sweet Tea. And I love saying this, as with all things, the gay men just took it over. They just took over the book. I thought for a while that there would be someone else that would actually write a book that focused on Black Southern women who love women. And at all of these performances that I was doing around the country, inevitably a woman in the audience would ask the question during the Q&A, well, when are you going to write our story? When are you going to do a book on us? After, a few years passed and no one had done it, in 2012, I made the decision to go back to the South and start interviewing women. And that process was over a 2-year period. I started the first interviews in, I think, May of 2012 and conducted the last interview in September of 2014. I think that's pretty much the coverage. I interviewed 79 women, ages 18 to 74. In pretty much the same southern states that I did for Sweet Tea. And this time I went into it knowing that there would be some kind of performance that came out of it. But because I had so much material, and because I wanted to be even more creative with the form for this book, my editor, Mark Simpson Voss is his name. He's my editor at the University of North Carolina Press. Came up with this idea of 2 different books, and I thought he was absolutely nuts. But he said, why don't you think about doing, what I'm calling the archival version, where you can include big chunks of the original oral history interviews, and you can do all the academic stuff to talk about methodology and the politics of you being a man, collecting these stories of women, and that book can be as long as you want.
Oh wow, free reign.
Yeah. Because they're just gonna print that on demand, and that's gonna be marketed to academics.
Oh, cool.
And that book is called Black Queer Southern Women in Oral History. Then the other book, he said, could be the creative nonfiction book. And he said, you can let your imagination and creativity just go wild. You can go full throttle with that version. He said, but it needs to be much shorter, and we'll market that to a general audience. And so that one is still called Honeypot. It was such a freeing and rewarding experience to be able to focus on a creative version of this material, and I had so much fun. I went to Australia, which is my place to write, because it's the only place that I can really get away and no one really bother me, because there's so many pulls on my time. So I have friends over there who allow me to come and stay with them. They don't bother me. They know I'm there to write. And so I went there this past December, and I finished a draft of the creative nonfiction book. And I'm really excited about it. And hopefully both books will be out this time next year.
It's almost like creating more books gave you more freedom, oddly enough, right? It sounds counterintuitive. Like it should be more daunting, because it's like, one was bad enough, now I have to make 2.
Right.
But it's fascinating that it actually gave you more freedom.
Yes, it did. It gave me a whole lot more freedom, and in a way that I didn't even realize until I started writing. And the creative process just sort of took over. The muse was really with me, and I was in a zone, and it was great. The other thing that I'm working on is a documentary film about Sweet Tea. That is another collaboration. That's a collaboration with a colleague of mine, by the name of John Jackson Jr. And John is an anthropologist by training and a documentary filmmaker and a dean at the University of Pennsylvania. He approached me about making a film about Sweet Tea not too long after the play debuted in 2010. And we talked about it for years and we never sort of moved on it. And then 3 years ago, we moved on it and we started shooting footage. So the film is also kind of experimental in that we go back to interview some of the men that I interviewed for Sweet Tea, but this time filming them. And because it's been over a decade since the original interviewed, it's sort of a where are they now, what's happened to them. But it's also me performing their stories in front of them at their homes, in their church, where they work, with them sometimes directing me.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's when John came up with that idea, I was like, oh, that's weird. But seeing how it all came together, it's like, oh wow, that's really interesting. The other thing that is a part of the film is my own journey back home to where I grew up and my relationship to my hometown and being Black and gay and from a small town and how I negotiated that and, my relationship with my family. So that's also a big part of the film as well.
So this brings me to my final question, which is my favorite question that I get to ask people. And that is their version of a better world. Obviously, the title of this podcast is Imagine Otherwise. And I get to talk with amazing people like yourself who are doing just that. When they step in front of a classroom, in your case, when they step on stage, when they sit down in front of that scary blanking cursor and that blank page, what comes out in response, so that world that you're working towards. So I'll ask you, what kind of world are you trying to build? What kind of world do you want?
I have a saying that my friends know that they associate with me, and that saying is, I just want everyone to be free. And when I mean that on multiple levels, I want people to be free to be themselves, to be free to just move in the world unencumbered by what other people think about them based on their race, their gender, their sexuality, their economic status. I want that kind of freedom for everyone, and I know that's kind of a utopic vision, but I want that. I also want a world in which people feel free to be themselves in an interior way. In other words, I want people to feel like it's okay for you to, if you are gay, that's okay. Be gay. If you are into certain kinds of things, that's okay. Do that. But don't cordon off parts of yourself to yourself or to other people because of fear. One of the things I tell young people who are struggling with coming out to their parents or their families in general because of the fear of rejection, I tell them often, you have to love yourself more than your fear of being rejected by your family. Because your family has to go through the same process that you went through in terms of accepting who you are, your sexuality, for instance. That didn't happen overnight. You went through multiple stages of feelings and then recognition of those feelings, acknowledging those feelings, to feeling comfortable with accepting who you are. And you got to get family, parents time to do that as well. Now, sometimes that happens quickly, or sometimes the family will say, oh, well, you're not telling us anything new. We already knew that. Next question. Or sometimes it doesn't go well. But you can't worry about that. You have to stand inside your own truth and allow the family members, the loved ones to go through that process. But you've got to really love yourself. And the more you love yourself, the more confident you will be in your own skin. And so I want a world in which more people feel that they can do that. I also want to live in a world where people are generous, not only with their feedback to people, but generous with the things that they've been given or that they worked for. I told someone very recently that capitalism has already happened. I mean, that's the world in which we live in. And we can't really change that. One person is not going to change that. One nation is not going to change that. But what we can change is our relationship to capitalism. So I'm a person who names and claims his bouginess. I love nice things. And I also like sharing things. My partner and I built a home that is far too big for the two of us. But the home was not just for us. We consider it a community home. So we have gatherings here for the community. We think of our house as a community space. But if I were a different kind of person, we could have just built this home for us and, have people admire it from afar, but not share it, not open it up to the community. And so I want to live in a world in which other people who have reached a certain status or who have certain things to share those things with others, empower other people to go out and share their gifts with other folks by giving them a platform, by giving them a place to break bread with people, by giving them a place to dance, by giving them a place to sing, by giving them all kinds of resources that they may not have access to for whatever reason, but you have access to those things. So share them to empower them. That's my version of paying it forward. And I think that that's the kind of world I want to live in.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your version of imagining otherwise.
It was my pleasure. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Check out our website at ideasonfire.net to listen to full episodes, read show notes, and see links to the people, books, and projects discussed on the show. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter to find out when new episodes are released and to get tips to help you rock your interdisciplinary career.